Welcome back to my channel. As you may have noticed, when not dealing with trolls, I've been talking a lot about relationships. I don't mean just the serious ones. I'm also very concerned about the general attitudes I'm seeing between men and women, which drastically changed starting in the 1960s. These changes have often been to the detriment of both sides. Many supposed victories have been bad overall for the supposed winners. It was a pretty volatile period in the United States, including changes that affected relationships to this day. It so happens I spent my teenage and early young adult time during that decade, so I got to witness it firsthand. One really big thing was the use of the first birth control pills at the start of that decade. Another big one was modern feminism, as exemplified by Betty Friedan in her book, The Feminine Mystique in 1963. But I also know that men were sometimes artificially holding women back. So, of course, there was justification for women to fight for improvements. Thus, men are also at fault. Deciding who started it would be like deciding which came first, the chicken or the egg. Let's start with a common complaint feminists had about how a woman who had multiple sexual relationships was labeled a slut, yet a man who did the same thing got praised. Double standard was the cry from women. Understandably so. Unfortunately, the solution I usually saw from feminists was to lower the standard of behavior for women to be like men. Somehow, I don't see that as making society better. And it hurt women the most because, like it or not, women tend to suffer more from an unplanned pregnancy than men will. A common remark made by men during that time was, "Show me a woman who wants to be liberated, and I'll show you a man who will happily liberate her." The new, lower standard simply gave men more opportunities to take advantage of them. So, birth control pill or not, we got a lot more single mothers out there, which tends to leave them in poverty. Not exactly what I would consider to be a victory for women. It used to be that guys and girls would have casual dates at first. Who you went out with one week didn't mean you didn't date someone else the next. We had multiple levels of dating. You may go from just this casual dating to different people each week to mostly dating one person, but not necessarily exclusively. Eventually, you may decide to go steady. In other words, an exclusive dating situation. It was a very big deal to take that step. The thing is, this was a good situation since, when you are young, you should be dating different people so you can make better comparisons when you are older and things get serious. Before this sexual revolution, for all the whining that some feminists made, it was generally the girls who controlled the overall relationships in school. That is, if you found out a relationship broke up, it was the girl who was more likely to have made that decision. A common reason for a breakup was that the guy wanted to push the girl into a sexual relationship and she didn't want to. If he was too aggressive, she dumped him. Not only that, she'd tell all her friends, and before you knew it, the guy had trouble getting dates with anyone other than the small number of girls with bad reputations already. Everything changed with the new feminist attitude and the pill. Casual dating became less common. Regardless of whether they used the word, a couple would tend to be going steady almost right away. Girls became more desperate to get a boyfriend so they wouldn't be stuck at home when the weekend approached. With so many girls being easy, the men could put a lot more pressure on girls to have sex without worrying about being ostracized by other girls. Comedian Bill Maher had a good routine about some of this.
I try to talk to the kids about, because to them it's history, what to me is like the sexual revolution. I try to straighten them out about this because they don't know. They think this was a man's idea. How ridiculous, because the sexual revolution meant basically that people were having more sex with more people with less preliminaries to the sex, and men have always been for that. That's no revolution for us, right? This was women wanting equality of sleaziness.
That pretty much nails it. Women got what they wanted and overall lost. Maher goes on and gives a pretty good description of how things worked in prior years, though, of course, he is rather simplistic.
Now, I will say this about women's liberation. Men, we were never against this, right? It's just that we didn't understand it, because liberation from what? You're winning. You've always been winning. It didn't make sense to us, because women in the old days seemed like they really had us where they wanted us. Don't you think? Women way back then, because they just let men go around. Yeah, we're the smart ones. Women are stupid. Women let us talk. And there was a big advantage to being underestimated. Women actually got men to say to them, No woman of mine is gonna work. Boy, sounds like a pretty good deal to me, I tell you. Honey, you stay home and relax. I'll bust my butt every day. Because I'm the smart one. Oh, okay, honey. I can't fight you on that. Oh, no, you're the smart. That's right, and I pay for everything, too. You stay home and have a good time. I work and pay. Because I'm the smart one.
Frankly, women knew many ways to manipulate men to get what they wanted. Not all the time, of course, but there was considerable balance. There's also lots of other things that were just silly coming from feminists. They wanted equality in jobs, which is fine, except they essentially wanted a quota system rather than one based ultimately on merit. I'm sorry, but I don't buy into the argument that equality is achieved by not applying equal standards. The fact is, some jobs require raw strength, particularly upper body strength. This is an area men excel at and women do not. So, naturally, one of the feminist arguments was that there were some women who are stronger than some men, but that's a ridiculous point. If you need to hire someone who is really strong for a job, are you hiring just any man or woman who meet the minimum qualifications? Of course not. All other things being equal, you want the strongest, which is almost always going to be a man, and only certain men at that. Some physically demanding jobs will accept people with lower qualifications because the job doesn't demand the best, or maybe those less qualified can be hired for less money. But the decision should be based on who can fill the job at the best cost-to-benefit ratio they bring with them. Which brings me to another problem: the qualifications that are set for any particular job. Depending on the job, these may be physical tests or intelligence tests or both. The first problem I saw was having separate tests with lower standards for women when it came to the physical aspects, just so more women would be hired, claiming they passed the test. If it was previously determined that X was an appropriate qualification level, it shouldn't be changed to accommodate a group that can't meet it, but that's what happened. Let me give you an example I remember. It involved the qualifications to be a firefighter, one of which was to be able to carry a person over your shoulders in what is called a fireman's carry, as may be necessary if a fireman finds someone unconscious from smoke inhalation. While it is true that there are other ways which are sometimes better for given situations, the fireman's carry is still a tool that will be best for many cases. The argument from feminists was that the woman could drag the victim by their legs, and this was actually better, since heat and smoke are reduced down close to the floor. True enough, but everything depends on the situation. For example, dragging someone by their feet down steps is probably not a very good idea, nor would dragging them through flames on the floor. There is a legitimate method of dragging them, holding the upper part of the body instead of the feet, but that would not always be the best choice either. The point is, a strong man has more options, thus the opportunity to be able to select the best option for a given situation. And even if it is dragging someone by their feet, a strong man can do it faster. There may be advantages women have. Fine, make them. But don't pretend you have advantages you don't actually have. There is a third situation within this basic issue of qualifications. I remember a woman giving her achievements, which were quite impressive. But she also said this: I passed the same test as the men did. So, that's great. Not a lower standard for women. But there can still be a problem in today's way of doing things. Sometimes the standards are not lowered just for women. After all, that doesn't really look too good, does it? But what some have done is lower their standards for everyone, men and women. This automatically qualifies more women, which was the reason for the change, and also more men. But then they apply the argument I described before, where anyone who passes the test should have an equal chance of being hired, ignoring how well they did. Don't we still want the best candidates, not just anyone who passes the test? Tests only set a minimum qualification. I'm not judging that particular woman's achievements because I never could find out whether the qualifications were lowered in general, nor how she compared to others who qualified. And, of course, all other things are rarely equal anyway. But it is important to know if the standards were lowered. I have reason to worry about such things being hidden, based on other things I've seen come from the feminist side that are, well, illogical. For example, They made a big deal about the tennis match between Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King in 1973. Billie Jean won, which is fine, but they acted like this somehow proved men and women were equal in tennis. They didn't talk much about the fact that Billie Jean was in her prime, while Bobby Riggs, even though he had been a Wimbledon champion, was in his 50s, 22 years after he retired from tennis. Pretty sure that makes a pretty huge difference. It was fine to ridicule those who thought an old guy could beat a young woman, but that's all. Even then, another item overlooked was that Riggs had earlier that year played Margaret Court. She was 30 years old and was ranked number 1 in the world that year. Riggs beat her 6-2 and 6-1. There was another such match between Jimmy Connors and Martina Navratilova. In this case, the ages were close. Connors was 40 and Martina was 35, but the rules were changed to favor Martina. Connors was only allowed 1 serve per point, and Martina was allowed to hit into half of the doubles alleys. Connors won 7-5 and 6-2 anyway. Over and over, these kinds of matchups gave distinct advantages to the women players, yet kept being presented as a battle of the sexes, which would somehow prove women were equal to male tennis players. Likewise, I remember a TV show where men competed against women and the same stuff went on. One example I remember was a race between an active woman sprinter and a man who was at least in his 40s. Furthermore, the 100-meter dash they were doing was a woman's specialty. The man's specialty was either the 400 or 800-meter run. I have no problem with such competition for fun, but let's not kid ourselves and claim they somehow prove that women are equal in these areas. It's why we have women's sports. Well, until they started letting trans women compete against biological women. So now we have men who were mediocre athletes beating biological women and breaking their records. Don't misunderstand. I'm not declaring that men are better than women. You don't measure that based on such narrow examples. Men and women are different though, and it serves no good purpose to pretend otherwise. That is what I object to. But what about the increasing desire of women to have their own careers? Shouldn't they be allowed to, even though it will have major repercussions with relationships? After all, the typical guy tends to want to be the provider. If his wife is bringing in much of the income, or even most of it, isn't that going to cause problems? I suspect it often does, but I would never say women should be restricted from a job they can qualify for. But I think there's a better approach. You see, as with many things, there was a lot of propaganda going on, acting like a woman usually couldn't be fulfilled if she didn't have her own career. Oh, there was some lip service to choice on whether to be a traditional housewife or have a career, but it was always very clear that if the choice was to be a housewife, those women were looked down on by feminists. Like it or not, if enough people say you have to have a normal job to be fulfilled, many people who would previously have thought that was silly will change their mind, especially if they are indoctrinated early in life and throughout college. Heck, you older folks could just look at the clothing you wore in high school and college and probably laugh at how silly you looked. So why did you wear them at the time? Because lots of people, starting with the fashion media, told you what all the cool people were wearing at the time, and you believed. Do you really think it is different with more important things? If you think so, let me remind you that pretty much every nation had slavery at one time or another, and that included some of the really smart people who managed to create a great nation in the United States, preaching equality. Why not? They grew up with slavery. Everyone they grew up with were told it was not only acceptable, but actually good for the slaves. The human mind can be manipulated to believe outlandish things. Propaganda works, for good or evil. My personal opinion is that if we better valued and respected the role of the traditional wife, having the primary task of the most important job in the world, the role of being the primary caregiver and educator of our children, we would have far more women quite happy with that role, or choosing to move to that role once they were children, but working before. Nothing to do with putting up roadblocks to women working outside the home if they wish. Just creating a more balanced society with true choice without the propaganda that places those jobs ahead of a traditional wife and mother. Thus, there would still have been changes in society, but much less, thus fewer problems with relationships today. The culture has changed, and some of it isn't a good change, and some of the good changes have gone too far. We need to discuss them in a thoughtful manner. Thanks for watching, and don't let the trolls stop you from speaking out.